We are starting with the human circulatory system. Now, the human circulatory system is also known as the blood vascular system. And the reason for that is very obvious, because it consists blood as the major connective tissue in it, and the blood flows through a network of blood vessels, and that is, it is known as the vascular system. But the major organ which controls the blood vascular system is the human heart, and that shall be our first topic of discussion today. Now, what actually is the human heart? It is a human organ for sure which pumps the blood. This is the basic knowledge that we have from our lower classes. Next, it is a mesodermally derived organ. Now, what actually is mesoderm? We have this knowledge from our Animal Kingdom chapter that mesoderm is the second layer of the three layers during the development of the human being. So, heart is developed from the middle layer, that is the mesoderm. Now, if we talk about the situation of the heart, where is the heart situated? It is situated in the thoracic cavity, in between the two lungs, and is slightly tilted towards the left. Now, let us just talk about the basic structure of the heart, and we shall refer to this image, which is the image from the NCERT itself, and I've tried to make a schematic diagram out of it. If we just see this picture, what actually is the heart and what are its parts, we should appreciate that this is the vena cava, and it is the superior vena cava because it is situated above and it is bringing blood from all over the body. Right. Now, secondly, if we talk about this thing in the lower portion, this is known as the inferior vena cava because it brings the deoxygenated blood from the lower parts of the body. Now, this is the right atrium, and this is the left atrium. As we know, human heart is four-chambered. It has got two atria and two ventricles. This major portion which you can see is the right ventricle, and this is the left ventricle. Right. So this is the left ventricle. These are the two atrias and these are the two ventricles. Now, if you talk about this red structure, this is known as the aorta, and this structure is known as the pulmonary artery, which extends from the right ventricle itself. Now, these are the pulmonary veins which bring in oxygenated blood from the lungs to the left atrium. Now, you should appreciate some other structures present inside the heart, such as the sinoatrial node, which we will talk about in details. Here, these white lines refer to the chordae tendineae. What is that? We will talk about in a while. Now, if you can see this thick muscular part, this is known as the interventricular septum, which divides the two ventricles. Now, these yellow colored structures are nothing but some nerves which starts with the bundle of His and divides into the left and right branches. We will talk about everything in details, but why I'm actually showing this picture at first, because once we start learning in a flow, we should know how to refer and what to refer to. So this is the go-to image for us to refer to. Now, if we talk about some general facts about the atria and the ventricles, the atria are upper chambers and the ventricles are the lower chambers. Secondly, the atria are smaller in size than the ventricles. Third, the walls of ventricles are thicker as compared to the atria. Wall of ventricles are thicker than the wall of atria. Now, even if we compare the walls of the ventricles, the wall of the left ventricle is thicker than that of the right ventricle. And why is it so? We will get to know in a while. Now, if you see this image carefully, there is a separation between two atrias as well, and that septum is known as the interatrial septum. Now, if you talk about this thick area, this septum which separates the two ventricles is known as the interventricular septum. And if we clearly see these areas which contains two valves are separating the atrium from the ventricles and hence are known as the atrioventricular septum. Now, once we're talking about valves, let us see this valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle is known as the tricuspid valve, because if we see its microscopic structure, we would see that the tricuspid valve has got three cusps like this and hence is known as the tricuspid valve. Whereas this valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle has got two cusps and hence is known as the bicuspid valve. The bicuspid valve has a different name known as the mitral valve. Now, if we see clearly, the opening of the right ventricle is into the pulmonary aorta, whereas the left ventricle opens into the normal systemic aorta. Now, let us just see how the heart works. Working of the heart. Firstly, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, they bring deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. The right atrium then pumps this deoxygenated blood into the right ventricle. Now, the right ventricle sends this deoxygenated blood through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. From the lungs, the oxygenated blood comes by the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. The left atrium pumps the oxygenated blood into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle then through the aorta gives the oxygenated blood into different body parts. Now you can appreciate in the picture as well as the information that provided you that as the pulmonary artery carries deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle to the lungs, this is colored in blue, whereas the pulmonary veins carries oxygenated blood from the lungs to the left atrium, it is colored in red. So artery in the body is pulmonary artery which carries deoxygenated blood, which is not so usual a case. Similarly, the pulmonary vein is a vein in the body which carries oxygenated blood, which is a little different from what is usual. Now, this entire process that the heart walks through depends on a few nodal tissues present in the heart itself. You should know that the heart is self-regulatory. That is, the heart is a myogenic heart. The muscles of the heart itself has this special contractile property which helps it to beat, and these contractilities are guided and controlled by these nodal tissues known as sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node. The sinoatrial node is present in the upper right corner of the right atrium, whereas the atrioventricular node is present in the lower left corner of the right atrium. You can appreciate that in the picture as well. This here is the sinoatrial node and this is the atrioventricular node. The sinoatrial node is present in the upper right corner of the right atrium, whereas the atrioventricular node is present in the lower left corner of the right atrium. How does these signals are passed? The sinoatrial node creates the first rhythm, and it can actually produce the maximum number of action potentials, and that is why the rhythm of the heart, the beating of the heart, is at par with that of the sinoatrial node. The sinoatrial node itself produces about 70 to 75 action potentials per minute, whereas the beating of the heart, we know, is also around 70 to 75 beats per minute. Now the sinoatrial node sends signal to the atrioventricular node. Now this atrioventricular node, which passes through the atrioventricular septum, emerges on the top of the interventricular septum, and it immediately divides into the left bundle branch and the right bundle branch. These branches then provide some minute fibers known as Purkinje fibers. The nodal musculature has the ability to generate action potentials without any external stimulation. As I mentioned earlier, it is auto-excitable. This is the language exactly given in your NEET NCERT. Now, this number of action potentials, which can vary at different nodal points, is different. Sinoatrial node has a different action potential. Atrioventricular node has a different action potential. Even the bundle branches can have different action potentials as well as the Purkinje fibers. But because the number of action potentials is the highest, is the maximum for sinoatrial node, it is responsible for initiating and maintaining the rhythmic contractile activity of the heart. And that is why the sinoatrial node is known as the pacemaker tissue, because it makes the pace of the heart. Now I'll just give you an extra information which is not in the NCERT and which is not even needed, but for your keen interest I would like to say this, that the atrioventricular node, the AVN, is known as the pace setter, because once the action potential reaches the atrioventricular node, it delays the action potential by about 0.9 milliseconds, setting up the pace for the beating of the heart, and thus the atrioventricular node is known as the pace setter tissue. Now, the heart is continuously pumping up. It is sending out blood, it is receiving blood, it is providing oxygenated blood to different tissues of the body, and it is even receiving deoxygenated blood from different parts of the body. So this is a cyclical process that goes on and on. So let us just study about the cardiac cycle. So we move to our next topic of discussion, that is the cardiac cycle. For that, I would like to draw a very boxy diagram of the heart. So this is our right atrium, this is the left atrium, this is the right ventricle, and this is the left ventricle. Now, if we carefully observe the connections of the blood vessels to these chambers of the heart, we find that to the right atrium, deoxygenated blood comes through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. The right ventricle sends the deoxygenated blood through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. From the lungs, through the pulmonary vein, comes to the left atrium the oxygenated blood, and from the left atrium to the left ventricle the blood goes, and then from the left ventricle it goes to the aorta and then to the rest of the body. Now, talking about the cyclical process that goes on during the working of the heart, first imagine that all these four chambers are at a relaxed state, and this relaxed state is given the name of joint diastole. During the entire cardiology section, we would get to know two terms. One is diastole and another is systole. Diastole is that state of a chamber when it is at a relaxed state, whereas systole is that state of any chamber when it is at its contracted state. Initially, all the four chambers are at a relaxed state, that is, they are at a joint diastole stage. Then what happens is the deoxygenated blood through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava comes to the right atrium. Simultaneously, the oxygenated blood through the pulmonary vein comes to the left atrium. Now, the two valves open. Which are these two valves? The tricuspid valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle, the bicuspid valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle. Now, due to gravity and the law of nature, most of the blood flows from the right atrium to the right ventricle as well as from the left atrium to the left ventricle. Now, at this stage of the cardiac cycle, the semilunar valves, that is, the valves between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery and the left ventricle and the aorta, are closed. Now what happens is the sinoatrial node present at the upper right corner of the right atrium generates an action potential. So the next step is the sinoatrial node generating action potential, which stimulates both the atria to undergo a simultaneous contraction, which is given the name of atrial systole. Now, this increases the flow of blood into the ventricles by about 30%. This statement is something written in your NCERT. Let me explain this with much more clarity. As I said, once the blood is filled into the atrias from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava to the right atrium and the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, due to the law of nature and gravity, because the ventricles are on a lower aspect as that of the atrium, 70% of the blood flows passively into the ventricles. The rest 30% of the blood is sent to the respective ventricles by atrial systole, that is atrial contraction. Now, the action potential is then transferred to the ventricles. How? From the sinoatrial node, the action potential then goes on to the AV node, and from the AV node, by the bundle of His and the left and right bundle branches, these action potentials are then sent to the ventricles. Now what happens? The ventricular muscles contract, giving rise to ventricular systole. At this time of ventricular systole, there is simultaneous relaxation of the atrias. That is, the atrias are now in the phase of diastole. So whenever there is ventricular systole, the atrias are present in the relaxed state known as atrial diastole. Now, ventricular systole, it increases the ventricular pressure. As a result, the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves are closed. Simultaneously, what happens is these semilunar valves open, and as a result, blood flows from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery and then to the lungs, and from the left ventricle to the aorta and to the rest of the body. Now, as the ventricular pressure increases further, the semilunar valves guarding the pulmonary artery from the right side and the aorta of the left side are open, and thus the blood flows to the aorta and to the lungs respectively. Now in the next step, there is the phase of ventricular relaxation, that is ventricular diastole. The ventricles now relax and the ventricular pressure falls. As a result, these valves, that is the bicuspid and the tricuspid valves, open up yet over again, and the rest blood comes in again. And this cyclical process goes on working. So let me summarize the entire process again. First of all, there is a state of joint diastole. Then there is filling of the atria through the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava for the right atrium and the pulmonary vein for the left atrium. Then there is filling of the ventricles passively. That is, 70% of the blood comes from the atria to the ventricles passively without any contraction of the atrias. Then what happens is sinoatrial node is stimulated and as a result the atrias contract. So there is an atrial systole, for which there is 30% of blood moves to the ventricles. Right. Now, there is a stage of ventricular systole. As a result, the semilunar valves open and the blood flows to the aorta and the pulmonary arteries, respectively. Coinciding with the ventricular systole is the stage of atrial diastole. When the ventricles are in a contracted state, the atrias are in a relaxed state. Lastly, there is a stage of ventricular diastole, and there is the cuspid valves opening, and there is again a passive filling of the blood into the ventricles. And then we get back to the stage of joint diastole. Now, this sequential event in the heart, which is cyclically repeated, is called as the cardiac cycle, and thus it consists of systoles and diastoles of both the atria as well as the ventricles. Now, the heart beats on an average about 72 beats per minute. That is, in a single minute, that is in 60 seconds, there is 72 cardiac cycle. Thus, one cardiac cycle takes around 60 by 72, that is 0.8 seconds. Now, if we divide this, around 0.1 second is of atrial systole and the 0.7 seconds is of ventricular systole. Now, during a cardiac cycle, each ventricle pumps out around 70 milliliter of blood. And this volume of blood is known as the stroke volume. Right. Now, as there are 72 cardiac cycles, so the total amount of blood that is thrown out per minute is 70 into 72, which is approximately around 5000 milliliter, which is around 5 liters per minute. Okay, so the body has the ability to alter this stroke volume and the heart rate when and where necessary. For example, when you are exercising, your heart rate increases, your heartbeat increases, thus increasing the stroke volume and the cardiac output. This volume is known as the cardiac output. So cardiac output is equal to stroke volume multiplied by heart rate. This is something, a formula that you should remember. Now, during each cardiac cycle, there are two very prominent sounds that are produced, which can be easily heard through a stethoscope. The first heart sound is named as lub, and the second heart sound is known as dub. The first heart sound lub is associated with the closure of the cuspid valves, that is the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves, that is during ventricular systoles. And the second heart sound is dub, is associated with the closure of the semilunar valves, that is during atrial systole, or you may say it to be as ventricular diastole. Okay. So, in this portion, we'll be talking about the electrocardiograph. Now, what actually is electrocardiograph? As the name suggests, it's a graph, which is popularly known as the ECG. It's basically a graphical representation of the electrical activity of the heart during an entire cardiac cycle. You must have seen these graphs quite often. And what does these graph actually look like? This is what an entire graph look like. Now, if we name these graphs, these has got 3 to 4 points. First is P, then it's Q, QRS, and this one is T, and then it starts with another P, and the next graph continues. Now, how is this graph actually obtained? Suppose this is a patient. This patient is attached with 3 electrical leads, one to each wrist and one to the left ankle of the patient, and then this is attached to an electrocardiogram, which is the machine which actually generates this graph, and this graph is at last obtained. For a detailed evaluation of the heart's function, what is done is multiple chest leads are attached to the patient's chest region and then gets a detailed cardiograph. Now, but this is the most simple representation of the electrocardiograph, and let us just first understand what is its significance. Now, once we obtain this electrocardiograph, we get these elevations, these peaks on this graph, which are named from P to T. Now, this portion called as the QRS is known as the QRS complex. This is the P wave, and this one is known as the T wave. Now, what are these different waves represent? The P wave represents the electrical excitation of the atria, that is the atrial systole. This depicts the electrical excitation, the electrical depolarization of the atria, and this shows the contraction of both the atria minded, not a singular atria. It shows the contraction of both the atria. Now, talking about the QRS complex, this represents the ventricular systole. That is, it shows the depolarization of the ventricles. Just shortly after the Q wave, the ventricular depolarization starts and marks the beginning of the ventricular systole. Now, the T wave shows the repolarization of the ventricles, that is the ventricular diastole. And along with this is hidden the atrial systole, as obvious. The end of the T wave, that is at this point, shows the end of the systole. Now, if someone gives you an entire ECG, if you see that entire ECG, it is a very long strip and it has got around these curves like this. Now, if someone gives you this entire strip and asks you to count the heartbeats, the number of heartbeats, we should simply count the number of QRS complexes and say the heartbeat of an individual. Most of the ECGs have this roughly similar shape of an healthy individual. So if there is some changes in this basic structure of the ECG, we should find it of great clinical significance. It might show some difference from the normal physiology. Now, this is the basic thing that you should know about the ECG, but I would like to highlight a few points that once we are talking about systole, we say it to be a depolarization, whether it's the depolarization of the atria or the depolarization of the ventricle. But once we talk about diastole, it is said to be a state of repolarization. And this is something we should be very aware of. And why is it called to be depolarization and why is it called to be repolarization? We would know about that in details once we start with the chapter of the nervous system. Now, there is a concept called as double circulation. This is a very easy concept to understand once we have known about this thing called as the structure of the heart and how the cardiac cycle works. I'll just show you through this image. As I said, this image is very important. As we can pretty much see that the right ventricle pumps the blood through the pulmonary artery and provides the blood to the lungs. From the lungs, through the pulmonary vein, the oxygenated blood returns to the left atrium. So if we consider this as the heart, this as the lungs, and this as the rest of the body, we can see that from the heart, there goes deoxygenated blood to the lungs. From the lungs to the heart comes the oxygenated blood. Before that, from the body, the deoxygenated blood goes to the heart, and from the heart, the oxygenated blood comes to the body. So we can see that there is two cycles of circulation that occurs. Once is the pulmonary circulation. Pulmonary is the term related to lungs, so this is known as the pulmonary circulation, and this is the systemic circulation. This is called to be systemic circulation because it relates to the other systems of the body, and this entire system is known as double circulation. Now, once we have known about the different kinds of circulation and what it occurs, how it occurs and everything, let us just get a slight idea of the structure of the different blood vessels. Now, if we talk about the basic structure of the blood vessels, that is the arteries and veins, all of these contain a total of 3 layers. Starting from the innermost layer, this is known as the tunica intima, and this is made up of squamous endothelium. If you have some basic idea about the different types of human tissues, you would understand what actually squamous endothelium is. The middle layer is known as the tunica media, and this is basically made up of smooth muscles and elastic fibers. And the last layer of the two is known as tunica externa. And this tunica externa is made up of nothing but collagen fibers. Now, if we compare the basic structure of an artery or vein, there are two basic differences. First, veins contain more valves than arteries. And secondly, the tunica media layer, if you observe closely in this picture as well, is thinner as compared to that of the artery in the veins. In the veins, the tunica media is thinner as compared to that of the arteries. So this brings us to the discussion of the blood vessels and its structure. Now, there is something very unique in this entire systemic circulation part of the body. What is systemic circulation? As we talked about here, the systemic circulation is the circulation which occurs between the different body parts and the heart. Now, what is it that I'm talking about? That is known as the hepatic portal system. The hepatic portal system is nothing but a vascular connection between the small intestine, especially the whole of the GIT, if you can say about, because most of the absorption occurs from the small intestine itself. So it's a vascular connection that exists between the digestive tract and liver. This is known as the hepatic portal system. So what happens is this: the hepatic portal vein, it carries blood from the intestine to the liver before it is delivered to the rest of the systemic circulation. So the hepatic vein carries the blood from the intestine to the liver, and from the liver then it enters into the systemic circulation. Okay, so this is a special kind of portal system, a special kind of circulatory system, endogenous circulatory system, which is present in the body apart from the rest of the circulatory system. Now, you might think that every other organ is being supplied with the blood. And what is the main necessity of this blood? It's to transfer oxygen and nutrients to different organs in the body. Now, the question is, does the heart need oxygen and nutrients as well? We know that the heart walks by itself. Now, if it walks by itself, it should need energy. Now, how would it get its energy from if it doesn't get oxygen, if it doesn't get nutrients? And how would it get its oxygen and nutrients? The answer is simple. It has got a separate circulatory system of its own, known as the coronary system. The coronary system contains coronary arteries and coronary veins, which supplies oxygenated and deoxygenated blood to the heart and from the heart, respectively. This is the basic thing that you should know at this level. Once you get into a medical college, you would find a detailed analysis of this coronary system as well as the hepatic portal system. We know that every other organ in the body, be it glands, be it the GIT, be it the renal system, is controlled by some or the other thing. Either they are controlled by hormones, or they are controlled by the nervous system, or both. Now, how is the heart and the cardiovascular system controlled? The answer is pretty simple. We have said it earlier that the heart is auto-regulated, that it is regulated by itself by some specialized nodal tissues. For example, as we discussed, that is the sinoatrial node, atrioventricular nodes. So, because the heart is a muscular organ and it controls itself, it is known as myogenic heart. But apart from this, the central nervous system has got some control over the heart as well. There is a special neural center in the medulla oblongata. There is a specialized neural center in the medulla oblongata of the brain, which can actually moderate the cardiovascular system through the autonomic nervous system. What happens is, this sympathetic nerves from the ANS controls the heart, and it can actually increase the heartbeat. When the heartbeat is increased, simultaneously the strength of the ventricular contraction also increases, and thereby the cardiac output and the stroke volume also increases. On the other hand, the parasympathetic nervous system of the ANS, it decreases the heartbeat and the heart rate. As a result, the cardiac output is also decreased. We all know about the presence of a gland which is situated above the kidney, known as the adrenal gland. This gland secretes two hormones, the adrenaline and the noradrenaline. This adrenaline hormone, which is known as the fight or flight hormone, usually increases the cardiac output as well as the heart rate. So these are the basic controls and regulation of the cardiac activity. With this, we have come to almost the end of this chapter. We should end our discussion by understanding and discussing some disorders related to the circulatory system. So while discussing the disorders of the circulatory system, we shall start our discussion with the very primary and very common disease of the Indian population, that is hypertension. Hypertension is nothing but also known as high blood pressure. We have seen people measuring their blood pressure. The usual blood pressure is 120/80, where the upper limit shows the systolic pressure and the lower limit shows the diastolic pressure. Now, if a person has the blood pressure above 140/90, that is the systolic pressure is above 140 and the diastolic pressure is above 90, then he or she is said to have hypertension. The second disease which we should know about is the coronary artery disease. Now, we talked about this earlier. What is actually the coronary artery? It is basically the artery which supplies the heart. So we get to understand that coronary artery disease must be something associated with the coronary artery. So this is also referred to as atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is nothing but the blockade of the coronary artery due to deposition of certain foreign substances like calcium, fat, cholesterol, and some fibrous tissues. This mostly occurs after eating and taking up some junk foods like oily, fatty foods and everything. And as a result, the lumen of these coronary arteries become narrower and as a result hampers the delivery of oxygen and nutrients to the cardiac musculatures. The next disease that we are talking about is angina. Its full name is angina pectoris. Angina pectoris is nothing but some sudden chest pain, and its underlying cause is nothing but decreased oxygen supply to the heart muscles. And this can be for any reason whatsoever it might be. Angina can occur in men and women of any age, but mostly in the clinical cases it is seen that it is more common among the middle-aged and the elderly population. And it occurs due to a very common cause which affects the blood flow. I would like to say that this coronary artery disease, where there is a blockade of the coronary artery, can cause angina. Angina is basically a symptom, that is, it is having a chest pain due to less oxygen reaching the heart muscles. Now, the next thing is known as heart failure. What is a failure? It means that the heart is unable to work effectively. The heart's function is to pump the blood effectively to supply the blood to every other part of the body. If the heart is not pumping enough blood, it's known as heart failure. We know the approximate amount of blood that the heart pumps is 5 liters, and if it fails to actually pump this amount of blood, then it is known as heart failure. It is at times known as the congestive heart failure due to some congestion, mostly of the lungs, and thus it's also known as congestive heart failure. Okay. Now, there are two different terms known as the cardiac arrest and the heart attack. Now, I want to bring all your focus to this point because we need to have clarification about these 4 things. Angina is nothing but decreased oxygen supply to the heart. Heart failure is the failure of the heart to not pump the blood effectively. Cardiac arrest is when the heart stops working suddenly. That is, it is not pumping anymore. And the last one, called as heart attack, is when the heart muscles are damaged due to less blood supply to the heart. We should not confuse these things because in the layman language, we always tend to say it as heart failure or cardiac arrest or the heart attack to be the same thing, but it is not the case. Angina is something where there is decreased oxygen supply. Heart failure is something when the heart is not pumping enough blood. Cardiac arrest is when the heart stops working suddenly. And heart attack is when the heart muscles are damaged due to less blood supply. Thus, we come to an end of this chapter. If you like the video, please share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and hit the like button if you do really like this video. Thank you. See you in the next one. Stay well.